Welcome to the Books of Titans podcast, where I seek truth in the world's great books. I'm your host, Eric Rostad, coming to you from the beautiful Books of Titans studio in Franklin, Tennessee. My goal is to read 200 of the great books over the next 10 years and share what I'm learning. I'll talk a bit about each book, tie ideas together from a variety of genres, and share the one thing I always hope to remember from each of the great books. Well, I've spent a delightful past month learning and reading about Egypt, specifically ancient Egypt. So book number 2 for the Great Books Project was Writings from Ancient Egypt. And so I started with that book, and then for this project, I'm trying to find at least one guidebook that helps me understand what it is I'm reading, what's the context, when were these things written. So the Penguin Classics book, Writings from Ancient Egypt, it's translated by Toby Wilkinson, and there are just a variety of types of writings from ancient Egypt. So there are hymns in here, there are battle narratives, teaching, so kind of like wisdom literature. There are some tales, so some exciting stories, just everyday legal texts, some letters that were going back and forth, lamentations, and other things. So it's a wide variety, nothing like super long. So these are all quite short, but just a variety of different types of texts. And so that was the first book I read, the Writings from Ancient Egypt. And then the guidebook I decided was also done by Toby Wilkinson. So the person that translated the Writings from Ancient Egypt has also written a book of history about Egypt, and that's called The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt. And I really wish I would have read this before reading the Writings of Ancient Egypt, because this provided such a great overview of roughly 3,000 years of history. And it really, had I read this first, I would have been better able to put into context what I was reading. So if you are going to start with some readings from ancient Egypt, I do strongly suggest going into a history before you do that. Just if nothing else, to just provide some context. So I went a little crazy. I was just going to try to do one extra book, but I ended up getting 6 extra books about Egypt, and I loved it so much. I mean, I had such a great time. Some were art books, some were other books about writing, and there was even one book that was about a specific pharaoh. So I'm going to go into these different books through this episode, but I just want to introduce each of these other books really quickly, and then I'll move on from there. So the next book is Egyptian Art. This is a Taschen book, so this is full of artwork from ancient Egypt, but it's also descriptions of that artwork. After that, I read one that is called King Tut, and this is also a Taschen book. So this is a lot of photography from the famous tomb of Tutankhamun, and but it also got into a lot of the afterlife and the Egyptian view of the afterlife. So after that, I read a book called Akhenaten and the Religion of Light. So this was the one about a particular pharaoh, and a very interesting pharaoh, and I can't wait to tell you about him and what I learned about him. The final 2 books, one is called The Tale of Sinue, probably mispronouncing that, but this is a Oxford World's Classic book. And again, this is another one that contains a number of different stories from ancient Egypt, but the main one here is The Tale of Sinue. And so that was the second to last one. The last one is another compilation, but this one is called Ancient Egyptian Literature from the Late Period. And I got this one for one particular story. So I only read one story in this one, and that's the stories of Setne Kamwas. And that was kind of 2 overarching stories that were about Setne. And that was excellent as well. So I'll go into those later in this episode, but those are the total 7 books that I read about Egypt over this past month. The study of Egypt is the study of civilization. It interacted with so many different groups that you've heard about, that you know about, from the Romans to the Greeks to the Assyrians, the Persians, the Nubians, so many different groups. So just learning about Egypt, you're learning so much about the areas surrounding Egypt and the history of that time. So I can't wait to read. I just bought some books about Assyria, Babylonia, and then also about Persia. And so I can't wait to read those and kind of see it from their side of it. Now that I've gotten a brief overview of the Egyptian side of things. So the time frame that we're talking about here in this episode is just astounding. The start of the pharaohs was in 2950 BC. So that's almost 5,000 years ago. And this history lasts until Rome conquers Egypt in roughly 30 BC. So 3,000 years is mainly what these books cover. There was obviously history before that in Egypt, possibly as much as 4,000 years of history before we get to the pharaohs in 2950. But the from when you start having pharaohs, that's 2950 until 30 BC. And so that is just a fascinating history. I learned a lot about that in the Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt book. And the thing that is neat is we have so much of this information. I was just shocked at how much information we actually have about this enormous time period. But we get this from temple walls, from coffins, from papyrus, people writing it, statues. They would have the hieroglyphics on the statues, and then obviously in these large tombs and pyramids. We're talking about a culture where the literacy rate was only 5 to 10%. So very few people read, and if you read and could write, you were part of the elite. And so part of what you're reading if you're reading these ancient stories, are some of them probably were stories that were heard by people and they were read aloud and that sort of thing. But some of the other things are just, they would have been for the elite. So it's just important to know as you're reading these things. Some of them are not like common stories perhaps, but some of them were. And it's kind of neat to think about that as well, as just maybe students in kind of learning or copying some of these texts 3,000-4,000 years ago. It's just such a cool thing when you're reading these, and also just to know as well that we started learning and being able to decipher the hieroglyphics within 200 years. So we haven't had this for a long. There's a long period where people were not reading these texts. So it's kind of neat that they're in a way being rediscovered. Egypt was a very bureaucratic nation. That comes up over and over in these writings. So just a very centralized, very strong government, very strong power structure, and things went according to plan in that sense. And you see that because as you're viewing artwork over this span, as you're viewing what's found in tombs, and you're seeing the consistency over all these years, it's really astounding. One other thing I want to point out here is there is not a single named ancient Egyptian writer with an attributed body of work. So that's also quite interesting. The individual kind of got erased from anything that was written. I mean, some of the stuff, it was like letters and stuff. It would obviously have a name attached to it, but just in terms of like main stories, like we've got these tales, we've got these stories that are in these books, but they're not attributed to an individual, a named ancient Egyptian writer. So taking a step back, just some top level takeaways from reading these 7 books about Egypt. One I hinted to is just the longevity and the stability of that civilization, of 3,000 years of rule by pharaohs. And yes, there were a lot of changes during that time, but the level of consistency is amazing. And just I live in a country that's a few hundred years old. I look at art and how art has changed just in the last 50 years, much less 200 or 500. But you're talking about a span of 3,000 years. And a lot of the art you see, it kind of maintains the same thing. Like people are drawing the same way. They're drawing in the same manner. Things are portrayed in the same way. Yes, that's a very broad paintbrush I'm using there, but So there would have been slight change, but like just the consistency was and stability and longevity was incredible. Second thing is just the sophistication of the beliefs and then the ramifications for those. I mean, we see the pyramids today. When you read about what the pyramids entailed, what the belief behind making those pyramids is mind blowing. It's unbelievable. And to think this is, I mean, the biggest pyramids we have are 4,500 years ago. Like that's it's crazy. It's really interesting. The third thing here is just, especially with the art books, it was fun because you start to notice certain signs or certain ways that pharaohs are portrayed, and just with some basic knowledge, you can look at artwork from Egypt and start getting an idea of what's happening in these paintings or these carvings. And that's just fun because now, anytime I'm in a museum or see something, I'll have a very base knowledge, but at least like something to work from and something to kind of move forward from. And so I can't wait. Later this year, I'll be in London. I'm going to make it to the British Museum, and I want to go to the Egypt section and just see what's in there and that kind of thing. So for the rest of this episode, it'll be a few more segments. So in the next segment, I want to give a quick overview of what I learned in the rise and fall of ancient Egypt. So just kind of a quick overview of some Egyptian history. And then in the segment after that, I want to cover what I'm calling a tremor in Egyptian history. So something that kind of rocked the boat a little bit. And then in the last segment, I will cover the books that I read, just some main takeaways from each of the books that I read, as well as kind of my main takeaway from my study of Egypt here. So for these 7 books, I like giving reading stats. These 7 books, there were 2,141 pages total in these 7 books. That took me 38 hours and 10 minutes of reading. It was an exact month, March 19 through April 19, and so that averaged about 14 pages per day. Next up, the rise and fall of ancient Egypt. Well, a friend of mine from high school in 2008, he called me up and he said, do you want to go to Egypt? He said, I'm going to be there, and there's an opportunity for you to play the violin at a conference if you would like to attend. I thought about it for about 2 seconds and said yes. And so I went to Egypt in 2008. It was probably a 10-day trip or so. And so part of it was at this conference, and then we had some time to travel around. So I went to the Great Pyramids of Giza. They're right next to Cairo there. And what's funny is you see the photos of the pyramids, and they look like they're in the middle of the desert. But the city of Cairo butts up pretty close to those pyramids. And I mean, there's even like when I was there was a McDonald's right on the edge. And so, if you look one way, you're looking at this huge city. If you turn around, you're looking at these ginormous pyramids. And that was amazing seeing the pyramids. It's just so fun. And they're so huge. It's hard to even imagine. I mean, the blocks are bigger than taller than people, and it's just these blocks going way up into the sky. And then I also took a trip to Luxor to see that area, the Valley of the Kings, and that sort of thing. But while I was in Cairo, I had the chance to go to the Egyptian Museum, and that was amazing. Unfortunately, during the Arab Spring, some of the works in there were destroyed. And when I went, there was like no security in there. And I mean, it was like a whole area of King Tut stuff, and you could go right up to it. I mean, it was incredible. And even since I had been there, they had increased security and all that. But it was pretty fun just walking through that museum and seeing all those things. So I didn't read a lot before that trip about Egypt. I didn't know a whole lot. And so reading about it now was such a fun thing. It makes me want to go back and see these things again with kind of fresh eyes. But I wanted to just take this segment to go over some of the history of ancient Egypt, and just a quick broad overview, and maybe some of their beliefs and just some things that really stuck out to me. So first, just wanted to go through a quick timeline, because what we're talking about here is from 2950 to 30 BC, and so you've got these dynasties that are happening, and so at the very beginning of the rise and fall of ancient Egypt, Toby Wilkinson divides up these different periods. So there's an early dynastic period, and then there's what's called the Old Kingdom. And the start of the Old Kingdom is the start of the Fourth Dynasty. And in this Old Kingdom, this is when the Great Pyramids at Giza were built. And this is 2500 BC. This is 4,500 years ago, those pyramids are made. So that's Old Kingdom. That's when that starts. Then there's what's called the First Intermediate period, and that's between the Old and the Middle Kingdom. So the Middle Kingdom starts in 2010 BC. Then after that, there's a Second Intermediate period. Then there's what's called the New Kingdom, and that's 1539. We'll get into the 18th, 19th, and 20th dynasties. Then we get into the Third Intermediate period. After that, we get into the Late period, which is when we start to see the Persians entering, the Babylonians, and then the Persians are coming. After that, we've got the Macedonian dynasty, so Alexander the Great. After that, the Ptolemaic period. And that goes right up to Cleopatra, who is the last pharaoh of Egypt. So there's a quick run through of just the different history. But what this book does, The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, is to go through a lot of those different periods, talk about the pharaohs, what did they do that was different, what did they do that was international, and then there's a lot of overlap in that timeline as well, where you've got Upper and Lower Egypt, which are flipped what would normally be in our mind. So Lower Egypt is north, and then Upper Egypt is south. But at some points those are united. At other times it's kind of two separate kingdoms. So some of these rulers would have been for one area, and so there would have been overlap in that. But there's also some periods where the ruler is over, the pharaoh is over both of those areas. So next up, I wanted to go in quickly. Just what did the Egyptians think about death in the afterlife and all that? So here's a paragraph in a chapter called Paradise Postponed. Ancient Egypt seems to have been a civilization obsessed with death. From pyramids to mummies, most of the hallmarks of Egyptian culture are connected with funerary customs. Yet if we look more closely, it is not death itself that lay at the heart of the Egyptians' preoccupations, but rather the means of overcoming it. Pyramids were designed as a resurrection machine for Egyptian kings. Mummies were created to provide permanent homes for the undying spirits of the dead. And if mortuary beliefs and grave goods dominate modern views of ancient Egypt, it is only perhaps because cemeteries located on the desert edge have survived rather better than towns and villages on the floodplain. Tombs have provided generations of archaeologists with rich and relatively easy pickings. And I'll end the quote there. One final thing, proper preparation for the next world was deemed an essential task if death was not to bring about utter annihilation. End quote. So these pyramids that were built, they were what the author here calls resurrection machines for Egyptian kings. And you just look at what was in these tombs, and then you think of the beliefs that were required to make these, that the pharaoh would have had all of these things in the afterlife with him, and so. In some cases, he's buried with his entourage, so kind of like in the Gilgamesh episode where I talked about Gilgamesh's entourage and in the actual Gilgamesh, his entourage would have been killed when he died so that they could all kind of join him in the afterlife. Same thing with some of the pharaohs, but then just especially in King Tut's tomb, you've got all these materials that he's to have with him in the life, but then in the next life. But then you've also got all these drawings of like what he's supposed to do, and it's astounding. But you think of what the beliefs are required to to make that make sense. It's a really interesting study. Next up is just the wealth that was in Egypt. So what was the wealth based on? And Toby Wilkinson says Egypt's famed wealth had always been based upon its agricultural productivity. So the agriculture was the foundation of Egypt, and it was the everyday laborer who was getting this, was creating this wealth, and for this kind of elite class that of pharaohs that really benefited from it. Next up, as a avid reader, I love learning about the Great Library of Alexandria. So let me just read a few sections or a few parts here. In its heyday, the Great Library numbered 500,000 papyrus rolls, representing the sum total of knowledge in every field of inquiry. The wealth of its written holdings was matched only by its glittering array of scholarly talent. As successive directors of the library gathered about them an astonishing array of visiting academics. There were one or two Egyptians, notably Manetho, a priest, and who was commissioned to write a history of Egypt, but the vast majority of Alexandria's intellectuals came from across the Greek world. Euclid, the founder of geometry, was brought from the Platonic school in Athens. Archimedes, Aristarchus, some other names here. And then I won't skip to the end here. While the court poet Callimachus compiled a painstaking catalog of books in the Great Library, laying the foundations for the survival of Greek learning into later antiquity and beyond, end quote. So there's a whole section there about the library, and it's astonishing. I started this year reading straight through the Bible, and so I always, I'll do that for each year of this Great Books project, so it's always on my mind, and so I'm interested whenever I see some sort of a connection. So let me talk about the potential connection with the book of Exodus here. With it, this is page 313 in a chapter called War and Peace. With its geographic proximity to Palestine, Ramses must have been a magnet for immigrants seeking a better life, and it is against such a background that the Bible story of the Exodus came to be written. Exodus 1:11 tells how Pharaoh put the enslaved Hebrews to work on two great store cities, Pithom and Ramses. Pithom, or Atum, has been identified as modern Tel El Maskuta in the eastern delta, only a day's journey from Ramses, while Ramses can be none other than the new dynastic capital itself. It is highly likely that Semitic-speaking laborers were employed in the construction of the city, but they were more likely migrant workers rather than slaves, although the working conditions may have made the distinction somewhat academic. As for any exodus of Hebrews in the reign of Ramses II or later, the ancient Egyptian sources are silent. The story may therefore have been a conflation of several unrelated historical events. On the other hand, as we have seen, Ramses was not one to let the truth stand in the way of his news agenda, end quote. And so that's one thing that comes up quite a bit is just, if something bad did happen in Egyptian history, it was not going to be written about. There was this deep belief that to keep the life of something, you wrote it down. And so that's why you have names written down and carved in stone and that sort of thing. That was to keep that person alive in some sense. And so when you wanted to get rid of somebody, even after they were dead, if you wanted to get rid of their memory, what you would do is you'd go around to the tombs and all that and scratch out their name. And this was done quite often if you wanted to kind of remove somebody from history. So it's another interesting things that archaeologists come across now is these artifacts where names are just crossed out and that sort of thing. So you get some insight into the history there of perhaps somebody was popular at one point and then became persona non grata at another point, and then maybe they were deemed good again, and so their name would be added back on there. So just a lot of fun history there. So those are some of the things that stuck out in the rise and fall of ancient Egypt. Again, I highly recommend this one if you are interested in learning more about the history of Egypt. Well, I said before that one of the things that stuck out to me is just the consistency, the relative consistency of this 3,000 years of history. And I know anyone with any knowledge whatsoever of Egypt probably would hear that statement and think it's the most absurd thing they've ever heard, because they'll know all the intricacies of how things did change and how artwork and beliefs and all that. But if we just do a straight up comparison between like our culture and Egyptian culture, just think about art for the last 200 years and how much it has changed. Like the Impressionists to Jackson Pollock, like that is a major shift, and that's 200 years. You look at art from Egypt, and it's relatively staying the same in the sense of like, this is how people are portrayed. Like you don't really see people looking at you unless it's a statue. So people are always presented sideways in the artwork. And yes, there are cases where that's not how it's presented. But just in general, I'm talking very, very, very general here. You've got these beliefs. You've got these beliefs about the afterlife. You have beliefs about the gods. The gods stay pretty consistent through these years, and so there's that just stuck out. It was so incredible for that amount of time. I mean, do you think of any other culture that's been around that many years and that was pretty much consistent in how it was run, in terms of there being a pharaoh and very bureaucratic and all that? It's astonishing. And I know saying that's there's problems with saying that, but just take it for kind of the general level. Along comes this pharaoh in 1375 BC, and he upends everything. He upends every belief. The art changes, the way the pharaohs are presented in statues changes. You don't have mummies anymore. There's no more spells. There's no more awakening of the dead to new life. They are erasing names of gods in the tombs and all sorts of things. And he introduces monotheism in the sense that there is a god, Aten, and that is the god who is worshipped. And it's one god. All the other gods, let's get rid of them. I mean, can you imagine what that would have been like? Where you've got this relative consistency, and this guy just comes in and upends everything. It was so startling that pretty soon after he dies, they go back to how it was. Egypt shifts back rather quickly. It goes back to, no, we have these gods. This is how things are set up. It goes back rather quickly. And his successor was King Tut, Tutankhamun. So we know his successor from his famous tomb. So this is the person immediately before him. King Tut his first name was King Tutankhaten. So Aten at the end, but he changed it back to Amen at the end, to go back to the way things were. So just a few of the beliefs and things that happened during Akhenaten's reign, starting in 1375 BC. So here's a part. The Aten was actually not the sun disk, but rather the light that is in the sun, in which radiating from it calls the world to life and keeps it alive, end quote. So Aten is sometimes called the sun god, but it's actually the light that emanates from the sun. And so if you see artwork and you see kind of this disc in Egyptian artwork, and then all these rays of light emanating from that disc, and at the end of the rays there's hands on each of those rays, that's Aten. That's this light god. And so if you think about what that entails, when the sun comes up, the light permeates everything. And so that would even go into the architecture of what Akhenaten does is all the buildings are open. There's no roofs. And so whenever you're in these buildings, the light is always there. It's always reaching you. And so the pharaoh's kind of trying to imitate that's what he's like to his people. He's always there. He's providing the light. So culture goes from believing, there's the god Osiris, there's these different gods, to going to one god. So monotheism is introduced. And again, Egypt is not a monotheistic culture at all. And this guy comes in and hey, Aten is the god, and he's who we're going to worship. The author of this book, Eric Hornung, he makes this statement about Akhenaten. He says he is the world's first idealist and the world's first individual. Next up, what this entailed in history is that now there would be no gods but Aten, and the physical existence of the old deities would be obliterated by the erasure of their names and sometimes of their representations as well. End quote. This later on, he says even the tips of the obelisks. So I guess they would climb up to the top of the obelisk, somebody would, and cross out the names of the deities of the gods on top of that. So that's the kind of thing this means. Like when this pharaoh is putting these ideas forward, it's not just, hey, you should believe this. It's no, we're going to get rid of the other god. We're going to get rid of the names written. We're going to erase this. This is how things are going from now on. You just imagine a culture so deeply ingrained in one way of thinking being confronted with this. It must have just been so startling. Here's of the afterlife. So the awakening of the dead to new life was no longer accomplished nocturnally in the netherworld, but in the morning in the light of the rising sun, and at the same time as those still alive, and was now oriented towards the east. End quote. So throughout all these things that I was reading about Egypt, the West is the land of the dead, and you would even see that in how some of the major cities were set up, to where on the east side of the Nile you'd have that's where people lived, and then on the west side were the tombs. But just the idea is that the West, that is the land of the dead, and I mean that's one of the things he shifts. That's how big this shift was. It went from the beautiful West up to the realm of the dead, and that even shifted. Now the realm of the dead is in the East. I mean, just a total shift of everything that is believed. There's no more spells. So read this. All the spells that had previously been needed for orientation, supplies, and protection in the fields of the hereafter became unnecessary. There was no Book of the Dead in the actual Amarna period, just as the royal books of the netherworld were no longer used. The temple and palace were indeed the new realm of the dead, one located in this world, end quote. So now the netherworld's not this place separate, but it's amongst us. It's in the temple. It's where the people who are still living, it's where they are. The dead are now among those people. So again, just these shifts in thinking. Since only daytime existence in the light of Aten counted now, a mummy was in fact unnecessary, and regeneration of the body in the afterlife no longer played a role. End quote. So mummies are gone. Last thing I want to highlight here is just that, or two more things, that there's a hymn that is attributed to Aten, but it's attributed to Akhenaten, he's even the potential author of this. It's attributed to him, but there's some people that think that he actually may have even written it, not just that it's attributed to him. And what's startling about this is there are some very similar lines to what you will see in Psalm 104 in the Hebrew Bible. And so I'm going to read just a section of this, the great hymn to the Aten, the great hymn to the orb, is what it's also called. So I'm reading now from writings from ancient Egypt. And here's one part. The earth is bright when you rise on the horizon and shine as orb of the daytime. You dispel the darkness when you send out your rays. The two lands are in festival, awake and standing on their feet, for you have raised them up. Their bodies are cleansed and clothed. Their arms are raised in adoration at your appearing. The whole earth sets out to work. So that's the great hymn of the orb. And let me now read from part of Psalm 104. He made the moon to mark the festivals. The sun knows when to set. You bring darkness, and it becomes night. When all the forest animals stir, the young lions roar for their prey. They seek their food from God. The sun rises, they go back and lie down in their dens. Man goes out to his work and to his labor until evening. There are just, if you read the whole hymn of the orb, there's a lot of connections like that to Psalm 104. So it's kind of interesting just to think, you wonder if there was some inspiration there, or if some of those ideas transferred there. But it ties back to this Pharaoh that shifted everything. He went to monotheism for a while. Egypt did not like that. They went right back right after he was gone. The other thing that's pointed out in this book is that that Akhenaten's was not a religion of the book, and so you hear that Jewish people will be called the people of the book, and so they've got the Hebrew Bible. There's a book associated with the religion, with Christianity. There's the Bible. There's a book associated with the religion. There was no such book with Akhenaten. He did not write any of this down. So perhaps that's one reason it didn't last as long either. It was not written down. It was kind of his beliefs. He was trying to change things in that aspect, but it was never written down. So just a fascinating thing, again, just when you've got things moving in a straight line for such a long period of time, for this tremor to kind of come through, it is a really interesting study. So next up, the final segment here, I'll go into some of the other books that I read for this Egypt dive. We'll close out here going through 4 different other books about Egypt. And the first one here is an art book. And this one it's a Taschen book, and if you've seen these, they're smaller books, but they are very heavy because it's nice paper, and you're actually seeing the artwork inside. And so, how these books are often set up is that you'll have artwork on one side and then descriptions on the other side. And they're all in color and just beautiful books. And so I got this one. It's called Egyptian Art, and the artist is a Frenchman named Presset. He actually has 7 different names, so I'm not going to try to pronounce them. But this is a gorgeous book, and what he did is just travel around Egypt. This is the early 1800s, and he drew what he was seeing. And so these are things from tombs. He's copying down the hieroglyphics exactly as they are, but then there's these other color drawings that he did of the inside of tombs, and these might just be like ceiling patterns or columns. Like the columns are some of the most beautiful parts of this book. There's other like wall art or drawings, or he'll draw statues. And what's neat is that some of these things have been destroyed since he drew them, and so we would not have these were it not for his drawings. Going through this book, I would just get to some of these pages and just be amazed at the beauty, the sophistication of Egyptian culture, the just the astounding beauty of columns. Like, why make columns this beautiful? I mean, they were made to look like flowers. And that's one of the things that is mentioned in this book, is that this is a quote, the Egyptians copied nature and in her found inspiration to produce their most beautiful works of art. The other thing that's mentioned in this book is about music, and it said the Egyptians considered music to be a branch of sacred knowledge. And I thought that was cool. So a lot of the artwork, you'll see lotus flowers, and that symbolizes life and immortality. But lotus flowers would be worked into so many different things, like columns and artwork. And there's common color schemes throughout this artwork, and it was really beautiful. And so if you just want to get kind of a good overview of Egyptian art, this is a good place to start. These Taschen books are relatively cheap as well. It's like $20 or $25, but they are, I mean, solid books and just a delight to go through. The other thing I found in going through Egyptian art is just you start to see some of the same things, and then with the descriptions along each work of art, you're getting to learn what Egyptian art entailed and how they drew particular gods. And so you can see how different deities and how they would have their hats. You see how it's common to show a pharaoh smiting his enemies. And so the pharaoh would have this almost like a nail on the head of an enemy with the other arm raised kind of with a hammer, about to put down that hammer on this huge nail type thing onto the enemy. So to smite his enemy. You see the things that each pharaoh would carry. You see, you just start to notice these things. And as you look at more of this artwork, things start to make sense. It starts to make sense why things are portrayed a certain way. And that's just a really fun thing to know, and a useful tool to have if you walk into pretty much any museum. Next up, I read the book King Tut, The Journey Through the Underworld, and this is also a Taschen book. And so again, a lot of these are artworks, so the books themselves go pretty quickly, but there is a lot of information in these as well. And so the cover of this one is just the mask that we all know of King Tut, that beautiful golden mask. And so you would get the impression by just looking at this book that it's all about King Tut's tomb, but that's not the case. This book, it really goes more into Egyptian views of the afterlife. So you actually see what's in a lot of different tombs that have been discovered, a lot of different artwork. And so yes, there is a strong emphasis on King Tut, Tutankhamun, but you're also learning about Egyptian views of the afterlife in general. So want to highlight a couple of those really quickly and just things I learned. And so first off, King Tut's tomb was discovered on November 4, 1922. So almost exactly 100 years ago. And the Egyptians, they believed that death was the pathway to eternal life. It was the doorway to eternal life. And I think in the past, I always just had in my mind that the pyramids were built after the pharaoh's death. It was like his grave, but that's not the case at all. Like, I mean, they would start building those like pretty much close to the time that the pharaoh started ruling. Like this was such a deeply ingrained thing. Like that was going to be his main thing. And it's because their view of death, it was the pathway to eternal life. It was the doorway to eternal life. The Egyptians believed that the heart was the seat of the soul, that it remained in the body so that it could be reanimated after resurrection. So when they find these mummified bodies, the main organs would be removed. The brain would be removed and the internal organs, but the heart would remain in there in that mummified body, because they believed that it would be reanimated after resurrection. So they would have jars for the other organs, and so they would be in the tomb with the deceased, but the heart would actually remain in the body. And they believed the heart was the center of wisdom and knowledge. And just kind of interesting, because we think of wisdom and knowledge as being in the brain. They would remove the brain. To them, that was all right there in the heart. And then they also believed that the flesh of the gods was gold. So the flesh of the gods in the afterlife was gold. And so, we have this famous mask of King Tut, and it's gold, and it's startling. I mean, it's just so beautiful. And the reason they did that is they believed the flesh of the gods was gold. So that's why the masks were gold. They were, almost just kind of preparing the way for the pharaoh into the afterlife. Let's see. Let me read from The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt as I introduce the final two books here, because The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt has this section where he talks about some of the different main works that came out of Egypt. So a lot of what I ended up reading is contained in this paragraph here. So amid the chaos, however, Egypt witnessed a second great cultural flowering. The Middle Kingdom was the golden age of literature, when many of the great classics were composed, from the heroic tale of Sinuhe to the rollicking yarn of the shipwrecked sailor, from the overtly propagandistic prophecies of Nefertiti to the subtle rhetoric of the eloquent peasant, and from the metaphysical dispute between a man and his soul to the burlesque satire of the trades. The literary output of the Middle Kingdom reveals ancient Egyptian society at its most complex and sophisticated. End quote. So that's kind of an intro into some of the final books I read here. So second to last is The Tale of Sinuhe, and this is in Oxford World's Classics book. And so it's The Tale of Sinuhe is the main tale, but then it also says in other ancient Egyptian poems from 1940 to 1640 BC. And so I bought this one specifically for The Tale of Sinuhe. It was mentioned quite a bit in The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt, and it was mentioned in Akhenaten in The Religion of Light as well. So this is kind of a late edition, but I wanted to read this story just because it was mentioned so many times. So this tale, it's a tale of a man with wanderlust, and so he travels away from Egypt and has many adventures along the way, and then returns to Egypt later on. And part of what's revealed here is just the Egyptian belief that that Egypt was the place. Like if you left Egypt, there would be this strong desire to come back. There was a strong desire not to die in another country, but to be buried in Egypt. So some of those things happen, or you see those ideas in this tale. But it's just a fun and exciting tale as well. The next one, so I just kind of picked out a few others that sounded interesting or that I had heard or read about in some of these other books. And so the next one was The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. And so this is a story of a man who has been wronged, and he's pleading his case before the high steward. And let me just read a small part of this. The eloquent peasant is very eloquent in his arguments for why he, in his pleading of his case is really interesting reading. So let me just read one part here. And this is him talking to the high steward, the person he's trying to get to take his cause and to help him. Stretch out to act. Now your eyes are opened. Inform the heart. Be not harsh because you are powerful, so that evil may not reach you. Pass over a misdeed, and it will be two. End quote. I just loved that. Pass over a misdeed, and it will be two. So it'll be two misdeeds. Final two stories that I read from this book were The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor, and then The Dialogue of a Man and His Soul. And that one will oftentimes be called The Dialogue of a Man and His Ba. So Ba has some ideas of what we think of as soul. And that's just a really neat one. It's a man kind of having a argument with his soul, and so that one is good. The Tale of the Shipwrecked Sailor, another fun story. And again, these are all very short stories. I mean, as I'm reading them, I'm just thinking, I just need to take this book upstairs and read some of these to my daughters at night. They're short enough to be bedtime stories, but they're very interesting. And just to think that people have been reading these for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years, or hearing them, is just kind of a neat thing. So the last one I got is Ancient Egyptian Literature, the Late Period. And this is translated by Miriam Lichtheim. And this is volume 3. So there's 3 volumes of this ancient Egyptian literature. And so one of the translations of Gilgamesh I read was by Sophus Hell. And I was just going back and forth a little with him on Twitter. And he suggested this story. He said this was one of his favorite stories. And it's called The Stories of Setne Kamwas. And so this is just one of the stories in this book, but I had to buy this whole book to get this story. And this is a very sophisticated story. It has a fantastic ending, a very surprising ending, and so I won't give that away. But But this was a very fun story to read. And so if you get that Ancient Egyptian Literature, the Late Period, Volume 3, I recommend reading that story. So if I'm to take a step back here and think of my main takeaway of reading and learning about Egypt, so reading some of the writings that came from Egypt, and then learning about Egypt itself, it would have to be that relative consistency through all that period of history, and it really comes strong when you start looking at the artwork and what's inside the tombs and how things are portrayed, and just to think of when this Akhenaten came along and he changed how pharaohs were portrayed in statue. That's when it really hit home to me, is like, okay, this was such a shock, and archaeologists can tell immediately when it's a statue of Akhenaten, because it was so radically different from what had been before that. The artwork is different. The belief system was different. And so you really come to understand, at least I did, part of what a shift that was when that Akhenaten pharaoh came along and just kind of upended everything. And just how that all got kind of swallowed away right back to how things were before that. And there, yes, you can see traces. You can see that shift in artwork. It had ramifications later on, and that shift in belief that had other ramifications, and maybe not just even in Egypt, but worldwide in ideas and in that sort of thing. So that's kind of my main takeaway, and it was a fun thing to consider, especially in reading the book about Akhenaten. So to recap, I got bit by the Egypt bug. This was an absolutely fascinating past month learning about the ancient culture of Egypt. I was amazed at how much we know. I mean, how much has been pieced together just from tombs and from artifacts and all these things, like just how much we actually know about what happened and who was leading and what they were doing. And yes, there are a ton of holes. There are so many things we don't know. And almost everything we do know is about the top person or the top few people, completely neglecting the rest of society. So yes, it's a very, you're learning about a certain aspect of Egyptian history, but nonetheless, I didn't realize we had this much information. I guess if I'm to compare this to the first book of the Great Books Project, Gilgamesh, I would have to give the cake to Gilgamesh. I did not come across anything that was that good in this Egyptian list, but I didn't read all of what is available in ancient Egyptian writing as well. But Gilgamesh was just such an amazing and sophisticated story. There was a lot of sophistication in these stories of Egyptian writing as well. But if I had to compare the two, I'd have to go with Gilgamesh as the winner so far. If you plan to read the writings of ancient Egypt or look into its architecture or art, please read The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt first, or some other book that covers kind of a broad overall history of Egyptian history. That will just help you put things into context. I actually had started the Egyptian art book and then just stopped it and read The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt and then went back to it just so I could say, like, this is artwork from this period, or this is a statue of this pharaoh. Just kind of having that broad overview helped place the artwork and then what was happening, what it was about, and all that. So, whereas for this Great Books Project, what I'm going to try to read the Great Book first before I read the guidebook or the ancillary book. In this case, this is one of those where I would switch those around if I were to do it again. And it was also funny reading through that art book, and the author would make comments like, people think this originated in Greece, but here it is in Egypt, 1,000 years before it ever showed up in Greece. And so in the study of Egypt, you see that, you see the influence, and you see this culture and how much how big of an impact it had. If you read the stories, just know that they are very short, and so you can get through them quickly, but they're very interesting. And just to consider and ponder that students would have learned or heard these stories, maybe copied them down if they were part of the elite, kind of learning language and writing and all that. And this for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years is mind-boggling. The fact that we still have them is amazing, and we should take advantage of that and read them. That's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. I'd love to hear from you, especially if you also have the Egypt bug, if this is a fascination for you. Tell me what I got wrong. Tell me other books that you recommend that I read, and forgive me for that very broad statement that there was a lot of consistency in Egypt, because I know a deeper dive would prove that wrong. But I think kind of at a top level, there was a certain consistency that is quite foreign to us these days. I'll be back in a couple weeks, and I'll probably be talking about Enheduanna. And this, so when I started the Great Books Project, I thought that Gilgamesh was the first book that we had, and the date given on that one was roughly 2100 BC. Well, another book just came out, Enheduanna, and it was translated by Sophus Hell, who translated one of the Gilgamesh versions I read. And so now I have to shift things, and there is a new book one for the Great Books Project, and it is Enheduanna, and it was a female author. The very first work attributed to an individual author that we now have was by a female in 2300 BC in Ur, in the city that Abram from the Bible came from, the city of Ur. So very cool. Can't wait to read that. I'm actually going to start that tonight, and so that'll probably be next episode. Thanks for listening. You can find me on Instagram or Twitter at Books of Titans, and go to the Books of Titans website as well, just booksoftitans.com. You can see my reading list, see what I've got coming up and all that. I would love for you to join me. I've kind of been lax this year in advising what's coming up, but I do plan to have some other online reading groups with some of the upcoming books. So hope you will join. Just sign up for the newsletter on the website. That's the best way to keep informed on that. So I'll be back in a couple weeks. Until then, keep reading, keep learning, and keep listening. I'm out.